Rohan Malhotra, the celebrated Indian doctor in the UK, and Anaya, the jealous ex-lover who knew his darkest secrets, were once bound by love, but their story spiraled into a shocking £3 million marriage visa fraud, betrayal, and a scandal that ended in suicide. Dr. Rohan Malhotra seemed to live a life many could only dream of. Born into a modest family in India, he had fought his way through medical school, earning scholarships and working long hours to reach the top. When he moved to the United Kingdom, he quickly built a reputation as a skilled doctor, known not only for his intelligence, but also for his ability to charm those around him. In public, Rohan carried himself with quiet confidence, the kind that made people believe he was destined for greatness. His neighbors saw him drive sleek European cars. His patients admired the way he explained treatments with ease, and his colleagues noted how he always seemed to have money for expensive suits and lavish dinners. To outsiders, his success looked like the natural result of ambition and talent. Yet, beneath the surface, there were details that didn't quite add up. Rohan's lifestyle seemed far too grand for a doctor in his position. While most in his profession lived comfortably but modestly, he owned a luxury apartment in an exclusive neighborhood, traveled first class, and was often seen at charity galas rubbing shoulders with influential figures. People whispered, but the charm of his personality silenced suspicion before it could grow. Those who envied him brushed it off as luck, while those who admired him saw him as a role model. Behind the glossy image was a man who carefully controlled every aspect of how others perceived him. Every photograph, every appearance at an event, every smile in public was calculated to strengthen his reputation. Rohan knew that his power lay in appearances. If people believed in his success, they would never question the source of it. It was this flawless mask that hid the secret life he worked so hard to protect. What the world never saw was the second life Dr. Rohan Malhotra had built behind closed doors. While his medical career provided a respectable front, it was not what funded his extravagant lifestyle. Rohan had quietly discovered a way to exploit the desperation of those who longed for permanent residency in the United Kingdom. He turned this into a business so secretive and so lucrative that it became his true source of wealth. For a price of up to £3 million, he arranged fraudulent marriages between wealthy Indian nationals and willing participants already settled in the UK. The promise was simple. In exchange for money, the applicant would be granted the legal pathway to stay in the country, while the spouse received a generous cut for playing their part. Rohan's brilliance lay in how he kept everything looking legitimate. He worked with forged documents that appeared flawless, bank records that showed convincing transactions, and staged photographs of couples that looked like authentic wedding memories. He even taught clients how to behave in immigration interviews, drilling them on their spouse's habits, birthdays, and family histories until their stories seemed real. What appeared to be genuine love and commitment was nothing more than an elaborate performance. The scale of the scheme grew quickly. At first, it was just a side business for extra income, but the success of each case emboldened him. Soon, families back in India approached him with desperation in their voices, begging for his help, willing to pay anything. Rohan accepted every deal, confident in his ability to outsmart the system. To his clients, he was a savior. To the authorities, he was an untouchable doctor. Only Rohan knew the truth. His empire was built entirely on lies, and each new deal tied him deeper into a dangerous game. Rohan could never have carried out his scheme alone. To sustain something so vast, he built a carefully chosen network of accomplices. At the center were a few trusted lawyers who specialized in immigration law. They knew exactly which documents were required and how to make them look convincing. In return, Rohan offered them large sums of money, along with the promise that their names would never appear on any incriminating papers. They became silent partners, guiding him from the shadows. He also relied on students and young professionals struggling with financial pressures. They were the ones who posed as spouses in his arrangements. For a few £1,000s, they agreed to play their part, attending staged weddings, posing for photographs, and memorizing fabricated love stories. To Rohan, they were pawns easily replaceable but essential for keeping the machine running. Their desperation made them obedient, and their fear of being exposed kept them loyal. Over time, he developed a system of control. He maintained meticulous records of every payment, every fake marriage, and every person involved. These records were not simply for organization. They were a weapon. Anyone who considered betraying him would be reminded that he had evidence that could ruin their lives. It was enough to keep everyone silent. The deeper people got involved, the more trapped they became. They couldn't step away without risking exposure, and they couldn't resist the lure of easy money. This loyalty was not built on trust or friendship, but on fear and self-preservation. Rohan understood human weakness better than most, and he used it to secure his empire. While others thought they were partners, in reality, they were prisoners of his design, bound tightly to a fraud they could never escape. Among all the people who crossed paths with Rohan, none knew him more intimately than Anaya. She was a nurse who had once believed in his charm, drawn to his confidence and the image of success he projected. For a time, she imagined a future with him, convinced that his promises of marriage and stability were genuine. She stood by him through long nights, celebrated his milestones, and believed that behind his polished exterior was a man capable of real love. But the illusion began to crack when she discovered his true nature. Anaya realized that she was never part of his carefully constructed future. She found messages, hidden transactions, and whispers of fake weddings that left her shaken. Every conversation they had shared, every plan they had made, seemed like part of a larger performance. While he gave strangers the dream of residency in a foreign land, he gave her nothing but lies. Her affection turned to bitterness, and the betrayal cut so deeply that it consumed her thoughts. Her heartbreak evolved into something darker, an obsession to uncover everything he was hiding. She began to retrace his steps, watching where he went, noticing who he met, and piecing together fragments of conversations. Each discovery fueled her anger. She no longer saw him as the man she loved, but as a manipulator who used people for power and wealth. The jealousy she carried was not only about the other women in his schemes, but about the life he denied her while offering illusions to others. She became determined to destroy the mask he wore in public. Anaya knew that exposing him would come at a cost, but the pain of betrayal had hardened her resolve. Her transformation from lover to adversary had begun, and there was no turning back. Anaya's obsession with uncovering the truth grew stronger with each passing day. What began as suspicion turned into a relentless pursuit of evidence. She followed Rohan discreetly, learning his patterns, the hotels he visited, the late-night meetings with strangers, the unmarked envelopes exchanged with unsettling precision. At first, she doubted herself, wondering if heartbreak was clouding her judgment. But soon, the pieces began to align in ways she could no longer ignore. She noticed the frequent deposits into his bank accounts, amounts far beyond the salary of a doctor. On nights when he returned home late, she searched through his discarded papers, sometimes finding copies of forged documents that looked too polished to be mistakes. Photographs of couples she had never seen before, staged in wedding attire, confirmed her growing fear. Rohan was orchestrating something far more sinister than casual dishonesty. Every new discovery pulled her deeper into the shadows of his double life. She began to collect the evidence, carefully storing away everything that pointed to his fraud. The deeper she dug, the more reckless she became, risking exposure each time she trailed him or rifled through his belongings. But Anaya no longer cared about the danger. The betrayal had planted a fire inside her, and her jealousy only sharpened her determination. Rohan, blinded by arrogance, never suspected the woman who once adored him could now be his greatest threat. To him, she was simply another discarded relationship, unworthy of attention. To Anaya, he was a criminal who had stolen years of her life and used his brilliance for deceit. She wanted more than revenge. She wanted to bring him to his knees. With every clue she gathered, the mask he wore so carefully began to crumble, piece by piece. Anaya's collection of evidence had grown into something undeniable. She had photographs of staged weddings, copies of forged financial statements, and even recordings of conversations that hinted at transactions too large to ignore. The more she uncovered, the more determined she became to expose Rohan, not just to satisfy her own anger, but to strip away the image he had built so carefully. She knew that keeping the truth to herself would only allow him to continue. So she made the decision that would change everything. With trembling hands but a steady heart, Anaya approached the UK Home Office. At first, her story sounded like the ramblings of a bitter ex-lover. Officials had heard similar claims before, often motivated by jealousy or revenge. But when she placed the documents on the table, the atmosphere shifted. The files were too detailed, the transactions too precise, and the photographs too convincing to dismiss. What had seemed like a personal complaint quickly transformed into the beginnings of a major investigation. The authorities launched quiet surveillance on Rohan, cross-checking his accounts, re-examining past visa applications, and questioning individuals linked to him. Each step revealed patterns that matched Anaya's claims. The puzzle began to form a picture of a hidden empire worth millions, carefully concealed beneath the title of doctor. For Anaya, watching the net tighten around Rohan was both satisfying and frightening. She had set in motion a chain of events she could no longer control. The man who once controlled every detail of his world was suddenly vulnerable. He didn't know it yet, but his life of deception was collapsing. What started as the fury of a betrayed woman had now become the downfall of a man who thought he was untouchable. The first whispers of the scandal appeared in local newspapers before spreading rapidly across national headlines. Respected Indian doctor under investigation for visa fraud became the story everyone was talking about. Rohan's once untouchable reputation was shattered overnight. Patients who once praised his compassion refused to return to his clinic. Colleagues avoided him in corridors, unwilling to be associated with a man whose name was now tied to corruption. The same community that had celebrated his success turned their backs, speaking his name only in hushed tones, as though it carried a curse. Investigators froze his bank accounts and seized his luxury cars, properties, and valuables, stripping him of the lifestyle that had defined his identity. The luxury apartment that once hosted extravagant gatherings now stood silent, watched by journalists hoping for a glimpse of the disgraced doctor. Rohan's world shrank rapidly, and every comfort he once flaunted became evidence of his crimes. Back in India, the humiliation was unbearable for his family. Relatives who had once boasted about his achievements now avoided public places, fearing questions and judgment. His parents received threatening phone calls from families who had paid him millions, demanding their money back. What was once pride had become shame, and what was once silence had become condemnation. Rohan, who had mastered the art of control, now found himself powerless. He was summoned repeatedly by investigators, forced to answer questions he could no longer deflect. His calculated image was gone, and the mask he had worn for years lay in pieces. For the first time, he was not the man pulling the strings, but the man caught in them. The empire he had spent years building was gone, and in its place stood a ruin exposed to the entire world. As the investigation deepened, Rohan's carefully guarded life unraveled further. Each day brought new headlines, each one cutting deeper into the identity he had built. The powerful allies who once benefited from his schemes abandoned him, erasing his number from their phones and pretending they had never known him. Those he had trusted most, lawyers, students, and accomplices, turned on him, offering information to investigators in exchange for immunity. The fortress of loyalty he believed he had created collapsed under the weight of fear and self-preservation. Alone and increasingly desperate, Rohan tried to regain control. He spent sleepless nights drafting statements, convincing himself he could outwit the authorities as he always had. But the walls were closing in, and every strategy he attempted fell apart before it began. His money was locked, his accounts scrutinized, and his every move monitored. The charm that had once made him untouchable now carried no weight. Behind the polished appearance was a man cornered, stripped of the power he had always taken for granted. The betrayal cut him as sharply as the investigation itself. He could not comprehend how those who had thrived under his protection now spoke against him. Worst of all, he realized that Anaya, the woman he dismissed as insignificant, had been the one to orchestrate his downfall. The thought consumed him, igniting waves of anger, shame, and despair. In the quiet of his apartment, he felt the crushing isolation of a man who had lost everything. The friends, the respect, the fortune, and the illusion of control were gone. Every phone call carried bad news. Every knock at the door signaled another blow. Rohan, once the architect of deception, had become its prisoner. The life he built on lies had left him with nothing but the bitter weight of ruin. In the final weeks of his life, Rohan drifted between denial and despair. The walls of his luxury apartment, once symbols of triumph, now felt like a prison cell closing in on him. He rarely stepped outside, fearing the stares of strangers and the questions of reporters who camped near his building. Food deliveries piled up at the door, unopened, as he sank deeper into isolation. The man who had once thrived on attention now hid from the very world that had once admired him. The pressure mounted with every passing day. Court summons arrived, and investigators gathered more evidence that tied him directly to fraudulent transactions. Rumors swirled that he faced years in prison and permanent disgrace. His name, once synonymous with success, had become a byword for greed and deceit. Rohan, who had built his empire on appearances, could not bear the thought of standing in court as a criminal. On a quiet morning, he made his final decision. The night before, he had spent hours sifting through his old files, contracts, forged certificates, photographs of staged weddings. They lay scattered across the floor like fragments of a broken life. To him, they no longer represented power, but chains that bound him to shame. He left them where they fell, as though they were his last confession. When he was found, the scene was both shocking and inevitable. Investigators confirmed it was suicide, the final act of a man who could no longer face the ruin of his double life. His empire of lies had ended not in a courtroom, but in silence, leaving behind only paper trails of deception. The doctor who had fooled so many had ultimately been undone by himself, his final escape chosen in the loneliness of his own making. The aftermath of Rohan's death rippled far beyond the walls of his apartment. News of his suicide spread quickly, fueling debates across both the UK and India. Some saw it as the tragic end of a man consumed by greed, while others viewed it as justice delivered too late. The authorities continued their investigation, determined to dismantle every trace of the fraudulent network he had left behind. Dozens of marriages arranged through his scheme were reviewed, and many visas were revoked. Families who had invested millions lost their money, their hopes for a new life shattered overnight. For those who had once trusted Rohan, the scandal left lasting scars. His patients, who had admired his skill and kindness, struggled to reconcile the doctor they knew with the criminal he had become. His family in India faced relentless shame, burdened by debts and lawsuits from those demanding repayment. Friends who had once envied his wealth now distanced themselves, unwilling to carry the stain of his name. At the center of it all was Anaya, the woman whose decision to expose him had set the chain of events in motion. She had achieved what she wanted. Rohan's empire was destroyed, his reputation erased, and his crimes revealed. Yet the victory felt hollow. She could not escape the weight of knowing her actions had driven him to the edge. While she had sought justice, what she carried now was guilt. Rohan's story became a cautionary tale told in whispers. How ambition without conscience can destroy everything. How betrayal can turn love into vengeance. And how lies, no matter how carefully constructed, will eventually collapse. His rise and fall served as a chilling reminder that even the brightest facades can hide the darkest truths, but they never last forever.